March 22, 1945. 10:47 p.m. Oppenheim, Germany, along the eastern bank of the Rhine River. General George S. Patton stood on the pontoon bridge his Third Army engineers had thrown across the river in darkness, boots planted on German soil, and urinated into the Rhine with the deliberate ceremony of a man marking territory that history had told him he couldn't claim. Behind him, his army was already streaming across, tanks, trucks, artillery, infantry, pouring into Germany proper without the massive preparation, the elaborate planning, the careful coordination that had characterized Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's meticulously orchestrated crossing schedule to begin the following morning 50 miles north. Patton had beaten Montgomery across the Rhine by mere hours, had done it with speed and audacity rather than caution and overwhelming force, and now faced the delicate problem of informing Winston Churchill, who had invested enormous political capital in Montgomery's operation and had promised the British people that their forces would lead the final assault into Germany. What Churchill said when he learned that the brash American general he both admired and distrusted had upstaged Britain's most celebrated commander would become legendary, but the words themselves would be less important than what they revealed about the complex alliance that had won the war in Europe, an alliance built on mutual necessity, strained by national pride, and held together by leaders who understood that victory required swallowing resentments that in any other circumstances would have torn them apart. This is the story of that night, of the crossing that changed the endgame of World War II, and of what happened when audacity collided with politics, when military genius met diplomatic necessity, and when Churchill had to decide whether to celebrate an American triumph that diminished British prestige or suppress his rage and maintain the alliance that alone could finish the war. To understand what happened on March 22 and 23, 1945, you must first understand the strategic and political context that made the Rhine crossing so important. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was clearly defeated. The question was not whether the Allies would win but how quickly and at what cost. Soviet forces were driving toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces had broken through the Siegfried Line and were advancing across western Germany. But between the Allied armies and Germany's industrial heartland stood the Rhine River, the greatest natural barrier in Western Europe, a river that German military planners had counted on as a final defensive line that could delay Allied advance for months if properly defended. The Allies had been planning Rhine crossings for weeks. The most important would be Operation Plunder, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's massive set-piece crossing scheduled for March 24 near Wesel. Monty, as he was universally known, was Britain's most famous general, the victor of El Alamein, methodical, cautious, and utterly convinced of his own strategic genius. His plan for crossing the Rhine involved weeks of preparation, massive artillery bombardments, aerial operations involving thousands of aircraft, specially constructed assault boats and bridging equipment, and overwhelming force applied at carefully selected crossing points. Churchill had made Plunder the centerpiece of Britain's contribution to the final defeat of Germany, had traveled to the front to witness it personally, and had invited the press to document British forces leading the way into Germany's heartland. But George Patton had different ideas. Patton was everything Montgomery wasn't: impulsive, aggressive, contemptuous of caution, convinced that speed and audacity won wars while careful planning wasted time and lives. He'd commanded Third Army since its activation in France after D-Day, had driven across France faster than anyone thought possible, had relieved Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and had been pushing toward the Rhine with characteristic aggression throughout February and March 1945. His operational style emphasized exploitation, moving fast to capitalize on enemy confusion, taking risks that more cautious commanders wouldn't consider. On March 7, American forces had captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, providing the Allies with their first Rhine crossing, though the bridge was in poor condition and far from ideal as a supply route. Patton had been incensed that another American army had beaten him across the Rhine and was determined to make his own crossing before Montgomery's scheduled operation. He'd identified Oppenheim as a crossing site, a small town south of Mainz where the Rhine was relatively narrow and German defenses were weak because the Wehrmacht had concentrated forces farther north to defend against Montgomery's expected crossing. Patton had told his staff to prepare for an assault crossing but to maintain secrecy, to avoid alerting higher command that might order him to wait for Montgomery. He'd positioned his forces carefully, stockpiled assault boats and bridging equipment, conducted reconnaissance, and waited for the right moment. That moment came on March 22, when German defenses at Oppenheim were identified as minimal and weather conditions were favorable. At 10 p.m. on March 22, without informing Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower or requesting permission from higher headquarters, Patton ordered the 5th Infantry Division to cross the Rhine at Oppenheim. The assault was conducted with minimal preparation, no preliminary bombardment that might alert the Germans, just infantry and assault boats paddling across under cover of darkness, establishing a bridgehead, and holding it while engineers worked frantically to construct pontoon bridges that would allow armor and heavy equipment to follow. By midnight, the bridgehead was secure. By dawn on March 23, engineers had completed the first pontoon bridge and armor was crossing. By mid-morning, Patton's Third Army had multiple divisions across the Rhine and was advancing inland with minimal opposition. The Germans, focused on defending against Montgomery's expected crossing farther north, had been caught completely by surprise. It was at this point, with his crossing accomplished and his forces pouring into Germany, that Patton called his superior, General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group. Bradley later recounted Patton's words, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley asked about casualties. Patton replied that losses had been minimal, then added with obvious satisfaction, and without even a preliminary bombardment. "Montgomery's crossing is going to be a spectacle, but we've already done it quietly." Bradley understood immediately the political implications. Montgomery's Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin in less than 24 hours with Churchill in attendance. The British had made the crossing a major propaganda event, a demonstration that British forces were leading the final assault on Germany. Patton's successful crossing, achieved with a fraction of the resources and ahead of the scheduled timeline, would inevitably be seen as upstaging the British operation. Bradley consulted with Eisenhower, who was simultaneously impressed by Patton's success and horrified by the diplomatic complications. Eisenhower had been managing the difficult alliance between American and British forces throughout the war, had dealt with Montgomery's prickly ego and Patton's insubordination, had navigated the complex politics of coalition warfare where strategy was inseparable from national prestige. He knew that Churchill had invested enormous political capital in Montgomery's Rhine crossing, that the British public needed victories they could claim as their own after years of American forces increasingly dominating the Western Front. Eisenhower's solution was to delay announcing Patton's crossing until after Montgomery's operation had begun, allowing the British their moment while not suppressing the American achievement. He ordered Patton to continue his advance but to maintain operational security about the timing and circumstances of the crossing. News of the Oppenheim crossing would be released, but carefully managed to avoid overshadowing plunder. But word had already begun spreading. War correspondents attached to Third Army knew about the crossing and were filing stories. Allied intelligence monitoring German communications heard Wehrmacht reports of American forces crossing at Oppenheim. By the morning of March 23, senior Allied commanders including Montgomery knew that Patton had beaten them across the Rhine. Montgomery's reaction was predictable fury. He'd spent weeks planning his operation, had assembled massive resources, had coordinated with air forces and artillery, and now learned that an American general he considered reckless and undisciplined had accomplished the same objective in a single night with minimal preparation. Montgomery complained to Eisenhower, argued that Patton's crossing was a sideshow while plunder was the main effort, insisted that the Americans were trying to steal British glory. Churchill learned about Patton's crossing on the morning of March 23, hours before he was scheduled to join Montgomery on the Rhine for Operation Plunder's launch. His initial reaction, witnessed by his personal secretary and several staff members, was volcanic rage. Churchill had built much of his political survival on demonstrating British military relevance, on showing that Britain remained a great power capable of decisive action. The Rhine crossing was supposed to be Britain's triumph, Montgomery's vindication, proof that British forces were leading the final defeat of Nazi Germany. Churchill's first words, according to those present, were unprintable even by the standards of his famously colorful language. He demanded to know how Patton had been allowed to cross without coordination, why Eisenhower hadn't stopped him, whether this was a deliberate attempt to diminish British contribution to the war. His staff tried to calm him, pointing out that Patton's success was ultimately good for the Allied cause, that it actually improved the strategic situation for Montgomery's crossing by drawing German attention and reserves south. But Churchill understood the political reality better than his staff appreciated. He'd spent the war managing Britain's declining position relative to the United States, had fought constantly to maintain British influence over strategy, had resented American dominance even while recognizing that American resources were essential to victory. Patton's crossing represented everything that troubled Churchill about the Anglo-American alliance, American audacity and resource advantage making British careful planning look slow and overcautious, American generals achieving objectives that British forces approached with elaborate preparation. Yet Churchill also understood something that his immediate rage obscured, that publicly criticizing Patton or diminishing the American achievement would damage the alliance at a critical moment when final victory required unity. He recognized that his response would be scrutinized by allies and enemies, that how he handled this situation would affect post-war relationships between Britain and America, that he needed to find a way to acknowledge Patton's success while maintaining British prestige and Montgomery's reputation. After his initial explosion of rage, witnessed only by close staff who knew to keep it private, Churchill composed himself and called Eisenhower. The conversation was civil but tense. Churchill congratulated Eisenhower on Third Army's success, acknowledged that Patton had achieved a remarkable feat, then gently reminded Eisenhower that Operation Plunder remained the main effort and would determine the shape of the final Allied drive into Germany. Eisenhower, relieved that Churchill was being diplomatic, assured him that Patton's crossing in no way diminished the importance of plunder, that both operations were valuable, that the alliance remained strong. Publicly, Churchill's response was masterfully political. When reporters asked him about Patton's crossing, Churchill praised the American general's audacity and skill, called the operation a brilliant exploitation of German weakness, and said it demonstrated the effectiveness of Allied coordination. He made no mention of being upstaged or angry, presented the multiple crossings as part of a comprehensive Allied strategy, and emphasized that British and American forces were working together to finish the war. Then Churchill did something revealing. He made sure he was photographed and filmed with Montgomery during Operation Plunder, which began as scheduled on March 24. The images of Churchill crossing the Rhine with British forces, witnessing the massive airborne operation that accompanied Plunder, standing with Montgomery on German soil, were distributed worldwide. Churchill made certain that British participation in the Rhine crossing was documented and celebrated even if it came second chronologically. Privately, Churchill's opinion of Patton was more complex than his public statements suggested. Churchill had met Patton several times during the war, had found him simultaneously impressive and troubling. Churchill appreciated military audacity, his own strategic thinking emphasized bold strokes and unexpected operations. But he also recognized that Patton's style of warfare reflected American resource advantages that Britain couldn't match, that Patton could afford to take risks because he had the fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment that British forces lacked. Churchill told one of his advisers that Patton was a great general hampered by the need to be even greater, meaning that Patton's genuine military talent was overshadowed by his need for publicity and his competitive relationship with Montgomery. Churchill understood that the Patton-Montgomery rivalry, while militarily productive, both generals drove their forces harder to outdo the other, was politically exhausting and revealed tensions in the Anglo-American alliance that would become more pronounced as the war ended and post-war arrangements were negotiated. What Churchill said privately about Patton in the days following the Rhine crossing was recorded in various sources, diaries of staff members, memoirs written years later, Churchill's own historical writings. The consensus was that Churchill admired Patton's military achievement while resenting the political complications it created. Churchill told Montgomery that Patton's crossing changed nothing about Plunder's importance, that Montgomery's operation was still the main effort, that British contribution to victory was secure. He told Eisenhower that managing prima donna generals was apparently a universal problem and that at least Patton's ego produced military results rather than just complaints, but perhaps the most revealing comment came weeks later, after Germany's surrender, when Churchill was reflecting on the war's final campaigns. He observed that Patton's Rhine crossing represented the essential difference between American and British warfare by 1945, Americans could afford to improvise and take risks because they had overwhelming resources to exploit success or recover from failure, while British forces had to plan carefully and minimize casualties because Britain lacked the resources for expensive failures. Churchill said this not as criticism but as acknowledgement of reality. By 1945, the United States was the dominant partner in the alliance, and British influence depended on diplomacy and strategic positioning rather than military strength. The immediate military consequences of Patton's crossing were significant. Third Army's bridgehead at Oppenheim allowed American forces to advance rapidly into central Germany, capturing Frankfurt and driving toward the Czech border faster than planners had anticipated. Montgomery's Operation Plunder, despite its elaborate preparation, achieved its objectives but at higher cost and slower pace than Patton's improvised assault. The contrast reinforced existing perceptions. American warfare emphasized speed and exploitation while British warfare emphasized careful planning and methodical advance. But the political consequences were longer-lasting. The Rhine crossing episode highlighted the declining British position within the alliance, the growing American dominance of Western military operations, and the personal rivalries between commanders that reflected larger national competitions for post-war influence. Churchill had managed the immediate diplomatic crisis effectively, had maintained alliance unity, had ensured British achievements were recognized alongside American successes. But he couldn't change the underlying reality that by March 1945, American forces were carrying the bulk of the Western Front burden and American commanders were increasingly making strategic decisions that British leaders could influence but not control. Patton, characteristically, was less diplomatic in his own assessment. He told reporters that the Rhine crossing demonstrated that aggressive action accomplished more than elaborate planning, that American forces had proven they could achieve objectives without the resources and preparation that British forces seemed to require. He stopped short of directly criticizing Montgomery. Eisenhower had ordered him to avoid public disputes with British commanders, but the implication was clear. Patton believed he'd proven his approach to warfare superior to Montgomery's methodical style. Montgomery, equally characteristically, dismissed Patton's crossing as a minor operation against weak opposition, argued that Plunder's success against stronger German defenses was more significant militarily, and suggested that Patton's crossing succeeded only because Montgomery's preparations had drawn German reserves north. The argument between the two generals would continue through the war's final weeks and into the post-war period, each convinced of his own superiority, each resentful of the other's achievements and recognition. Eisenhower, caught between his two most difficult subordinates and between his British and American political masters, handled the situation with characteristic diplomatic skill. He praised both crossings as important contributions to final victory, emphasized that multiple Rhine crossings had been necessary to overwhelm German defenses, and publicly refused to compare the operations or declare one more important than the other. Privately, Eisenhower was relieved that both crossings had succeeded without excessive casualties and that the Allied advance could continue on schedule despite the political complications. The Rhine crossing episode became a symbol of the complex alliance that won World War II in Europe, an alliance based on mutual necessity rather than complete agreement, held together by leaders who understood that victory required subordinating national pride and personal ego to common purpose, even when that subordination was difficult and resentful. Churchill's response to Patton's crossing, rage followed by diplomatic grace, exemplified the political skill that had kept the alliance functioning despite profound tensions. Years later, in his war memoirs, Churchill wrote about the Rhine crossings with careful balance. He acknowledged Patton's achievement while emphasizing Plunder's importance, praised American military prowess while highlighting British contributions, and presented the multiple crossings as evidence of Allied coordination rather than competition. It was diplomatic history writing, smoothing over the rivalries and resentments that had complicated real-time decision-making, presenting for posterity an alliance that had been more unified than it actually was. But in private letters and conversations, Churchill was more candid. He admitted that Patton's crossing had infuriated him, that he'd resented American ability to achieve through improvisation what British forces required elaborate preparation to attempt, that the episode had reminded him how dependent Britain had become on American resources and how limited British influence had become despite Churchill's diplomatic efforts to maintain it. He acknowledged that his public response had been politically necessary rather than emotionally honest, that maintaining the alliance required swallowing pride and accepting realities that were difficult for a British Prime Minister who remembered when Britain had been the dominant global power. Patton himself never fully understood the political complexities his Rhine crossing had created. He saw it as a military achievement, proof of his operational skill, vindication of his aggressive approach to warfare. He didn't appreciate, or perhaps didn't care, that his success had created diplomatic headaches for Eisenhower and Churchill, that national pride and alliance politics were as important as military results, that winning the war required managing egos and appearances as much as defeating German armies. Patton was a pure warrior who viewed politics as an irritating distraction from the essential work of fighting and winning. This made him an extraordinary combat commander but a diplomatic liability. The irony, visible in hindsight, was that both Patton's and Montgomery's approaches to the Rhine crossing were necessary and complementary. Patton's improvised assault at Oppenheim succeeded because German defenses were weak in that sector, because speed and surprise were more valuable than overwhelming force, because Third Army had the fuel and momentum to exploit success immediately. Montgomery's carefully planned Operation Plunder succeeded because German defenses were stronger in the northern sector, because crossing near Wesel required coordinated air and ground operations, because methodical preparation minimized casualties against prepared positions. Neither approach was universally superior, context determined effectiveness. But the rivalry between the commanders and the national pride invested in their operations prevented either side from acknowledging this reality. Instead, the Rhine crossings became another episode in the ongoing argument about which nation and which general contributed more to victory, an argument that survived the war and continued through decades of memoir writing and historical debate. Churchill understood this better than most participants. He recognized that the alliance had won the war despite internal tensions rather than because of perfect unity, that managing disagreements had been as important as coordinating operations, that diplomatic skill had been as essential as military prowess. His response to Patton's Rhine crossing, controlling his rage, maintaining public grace, ensuring British achievements were recognized without diminishing American success, exemplified the political leadership that had sustained the alliance through 4 years of war. As German resistance collapsed in April and May 1945, as Allied forces drove deeper into Germany and the Reich's final defeat became inevitable, the Rhine crossing episode faded in immediate importance. There were more dramatic events to occupy attention: the meeting of American and Soviet forces on the Elbe, the liberation of concentration camps, Hitler's suicide, Germany's unconditional surrender. The question of who had crossed the Rhine first and what Churchill said about it seemed minor compared to these world-historic developments. But the episode remained significant as a window into alliance dynamics, as evidence of the personal and national rivalries that complicated cooperation, as demonstration of the diplomatic skill required to maintain unity even when that unity was strained by competition and resentment. Churchill's management of his response to Patton's crossing, rage transmuted into diplomatic praise, resentment suppressed in service of alliance maintenance, showed why he was one of history's great war leaders. He understood that leadership required managing emotions, that politics was as important as strategy, that winning the war required maintaining relationships as well as defeating enemies. The Rhine itself, the river that had been such an important military obstacle, became a symbol of Allied unity despite the complications surrounding its crossing. The fact that multiple armies crossed at multiple points, that British and American forces both achieved successful operations, that the crossings enabled the final defeat of Nazi Germany, these became the dominant narrative, obscuring the rivalries and resentments that had complicated the real-time events. As the evening settled over Oppenheim on March 23, 1945, as Patton's tanks rumbled across pontoon bridges and advanced into Germany, as Churchill stood with Montgomery watching British forces begin their own crossing 50 miles north, as Eisenhower managed the political aftermath from his headquarters, the Rhine flowed on as it had for millennia, indifferent to the human dramas played out along its banks. The river would outlast all the generals who'd crossed it, all the politicians who'd invested pride in those crossings, all the soldiers who'd fought and died securing its bridges. History would remember the crossings as Allied victories, strategic successes that hastened Germany's defeat. What Churchill said when Patton crossed first would become a footnote, a historical curiosity revealing the complex personalities and politics behind the military operations. The rage, the rivalry, the resentment, all would fade into diplomatic history in carefully crafted memoirs. Only the river remained, and the bridges, and the graves, and the simple fact that it had been crossed, that Germany had been invaded, that the war would soon be over, and that all the ego and politics and national pride, however important they'd seemed at the time, were ultimately subordinate to the larger achievement of defeating fascism and ending the most destructive war in human history. The words were spoken, the feelings were felt, and then both were buried beneath the necessities of alliance and the requirements of victory, remembered only by those few who'd been present and who understood that wars are won not just on battlefields but in diplomatic conversations, not just through military genius but through political skill, not just by generals who fight but by leaders who manage the complex human relationships that make victory possible even when those relationships are strained by ego, ambition, pride, and the inevitable tensions between allies who share goals but compete for glory.